Liza Bernard from the Norwich Bookstore, but obviously Zooming from home. And while we are not yet open for browsing, we are in the store every day except Sunday to take your calls and emails and web orders. And the big news is that we will be opening the doors and welcoming you back into the store, thank God, on Saturday, beginning on Saturday the 24th. So that's the big announcement tonight for the Norwich Bookstore. We welcome you to this discussion this evening with William Arkin, the author of The General Has No Clothes, The Untold Story of Our, The Untold Story of Our Endless Wars, and James Bandler, who is a ProPublica, I have such a hard time saying that, senior reporter. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see Michael Pryles's email. He's working tech end of things. So if you get an email message from him, that's his job tonight. And the event is being recorded. It will be posted on our website. Down in the lower right-hand corner, we have a block with links to past events. So if you missed something, or if you want to share this with a friend later, it will be there. So for this Zoom event, we ask that you keep your video off and your audio mute. We recommend that you turn on the chat button, which will bring up a panel on the side of your screen. And there you'll see a link to the book, and you can add your questions or comments later. The format's pretty straightforward. I'll do a brief introduction of our speakers, and then our guests will have the stage. And towards the end, we'll open up, or actually about halfway through, we'll open up questions that you can pose by typing them into the chat box. We're not going to do raise hands and turn on audio and video. That just gets too complicated. But we will be sharing your questions. I will be sharing your questions, so I will be jumping back on. And as I was writing this introduction, I realized I could spend the whole hour just introducing our guests, but I won't. So briefly, William Arkin has been working in the field of national security for over 45 years as an Army intelligence analyst, an activist, an author, a journalist, an academic, and a consultant. He's authored or co-authored more than a dozen books, a couple of which we featured here in Norwich back when Bill lived just down the road from me here in Pomfret. Bill is the recipient of numerous journalism awards, and his reporting has appeared on the front pages of the Washington Post, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Newsweek magazine, and he's been expert guest and analyst for NBC News, CBS News, 60 Minutes, Meet the Press, Dateline, and other and multiple long form programs like Frontline and the History Channel. So in January of 2019, he was frustrated with the media's focus, and Bill penned a 2,200 word memo to his colleagues expressing this displeasure with coverage of the Trump circus, while the perpetual wars that the US was fighting was being neglected. And Simon & Schuster invited him to expand that letter, and that book, which was delayed somewhat by COVID-19, like the rest of our lives, became The Generals Have No Clothes, The Untold Story of Our Endless Wars, which was officially released today. So this is the pub date celebration. He also is publishing 2 more books later on this year. One is a novel of 9/11, History in One Act, and that's coming later. That's coming next month. And then on that day, the definitive timeline of 9/11 will be published in August, and you can pre-order those through the Norwich Bookstore. Happy to help. So James Bandler, who is a neighbor to the bookstore in Norwich, got his start as a Sunday writer for the Rutland Herald and the Barry Montpelier Times-Argus. He moved on to the Boston Globe and then the Wall Street Journal, where he won a Pulitzer Prize for public service for a series he co-wrote exposing the widespread practice of backdating stock options by business executives. At one point, he was also a staff writer at Fortune magazine. But currently, James is a senior reporter at ProPublica, which is an independent nonprofit newsroom. It's been around for about 14 years. He covers business and finance, and that includes corporate investigations, resource extraction industries, and defense procurement, which is why he is a perfect person to pair with Bill. So without further ado, I'm going to turn. Oh, I think I forgot to mention, so that you see the speakers who are talking on a regular screen. If you have your screen on gallery view, switch to speaker view, and then the people who are talking will be large on your screen instead of little tiny thumbnails, because we have such a large audience tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to you folks.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to the Norwich Bookstore, which has been an absolute lifesaver in a pandemic. And I would like to urge everyone to buy multiple copies of Bill's book at the bookstore. And also understand that the Norwich Bookstore, I promise not to mention out-of-state competitors in Washington State, and I will not, but it's the only line of defense against a company that is also a major defense contractor. So buy your books at the Norwich Bookstore. I want to say just before we start, Bill, just a personal note. I met you a quarter century ago when I was a cub reporter, and I was totally smitten. The first meeting in your farmhouse, surrounded by papers. And what struck me was like I was with this incredible ace researcher, but also someone who was able to do something very hard, which is to wrest secrets out of the most secretive organizations in the world. And also wrest other things, like on your desk was the guidance system for a Tomahawk missile that hit the Al Rashid Hotel in 1993. I was like, the story of how you got that mesmerized me. I don't know if you still have that item, which I think the Navy was looking for. And the other thing that Bill once almost successfully procured was a nuclear missile. And that's a long story, but he probably came closer to proving the case that nuclear missiles are vulnerable in Eastern Europe in a stunt that went awry with Greenpeace. And you can read about that in Cy Hirsch's Atlantic magazine piece if you Google it. But what really impresses me about you, Bill, is your encyclopedic knowledge of the national security state, your ability to explain it to people like me. So I wondered if we could start, if you could sort of paint a picture of this Leviathan and how big it is and sort of what's at the apex.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Liza, for having me at the Norwich Bookstore. I live in California now, so I'm not going to tell you too much about what the weather's like. As you two have said, I was asked to write an essay about the concept of perpetual war and to offer some prescriptions as to how to end perpetual war. And it was on a fairly quick timeline, and then COVID came along, and I was able to do some updates and bring in coronavirus at the end. But I also hope that I wrote a broad enough indictment of the military and prescription for the future that is relevant today. And given that the news actually today relates to perpetual war, which is a announcement from the Biden administration that they'll be removing the last US troops from Afghanistan by 9/11 of this year. The book is particularly apropos because one of the points that I make, and really the fundamental point that I make, is that claim is false. The United States is not going to remove its forces from Afghanistan. It's going to remove its troops, which means the people who are in uniform and the so-called boots on the ground. And I want to read a little segment about how I describe perpetual war and the perpetual war machine that will help to understand why this withdrawal from Afghanistan is not really a withdrawal. I say, the American way of war enables both troop withdrawals and continued fighting because over 2 decades of continuous warfare, new capabilities have emerged that fundamentally reorder the calculus on the ground. Capabilities that didn't even exist before 9/11, armed drones, autonomous precision strike, total surveillance, cyber warfare have emerged and matured. But most important, the bulk of what sustains warfare in places like Afghanistan is located in safe countries in the Middle East and Europe and even in the United States. And that machine, the perpetual war machine, is a global network that collects and processes mountains of information, moves that information around, sustains a worldwide targeting system, generates long-range attacks, and makes most of the decisions. This extraordinarily complex network involves the participation of half the countries on Earth. A hub made up of giant command and intelligence centers feeds spokes reaching out throughout the Middle East and South Asia and into Africa and Asia today. It is so little understood, so invisible, so resilient, and so efficient that even as 4 successive presidents have promised and then tried to stop warfare in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, the spokes have grown and extended to the point where we are fighting, bombing, and killing in 21 nations today.
That's stunning, Bill. And could you start a little bit and talk a little bit about how Obama tried to rein this in and why he was not successful and what could he have done differently?
Well, I'm not sure that he could have done anything differently per se, other than probably had more of a backbone to go up against the system. But the truth of the matter is that we've created a system in which there's very little political capital associated with ending what's going on. Most people, most Americans have no association whatsoever with the military. And the military itself has created a system of warfare that minimizes human involvement. So we don't need troops on the ground as much as we need before. And for every trigger puller, for every bullet shooter, for every pilot who is actually engaged in warfare today, there are literally 100,000 people behind them in the system that are making their warfare more precise and facilitating what they do. So it's the tip of a very long spear. And that spear is increasingly powered by big data and artificial intelligence and machine translation, so that one day it can be targeting people in Pakistan or Afghanistan, and the next day it can be targeting people in Mali and Niger. And that's the system we've created. And in a way, the public has demanded that that system be created because they don't want to see casualties, American casualties. They don't want to see Americans dying. And so the military has created a system which minimizes American deaths while at the same time achieving the goal of hitting the target. Now, do we associate hitting the target with actually winning these wars? I mean, can you name me a country in the Middle East that's safer today than it was in 2001? I can't. Can you name a country in Africa that's safer today than it was in 2001? I can't. We now see ISIS operating in some 60 countries around the world. And so even though the Pentagon can say we have taken away the physical caliphate in Syria, or they can say we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan, the truth of the matter is Al-Qaeda has not been defeated. The Taliban will likely have sharing power, if not take over in Afghanistan in the next 5 years. And Syria is a basket case. So the measure of success in perpetual war is a low number of casualties and a high degree of precision. It's not greater security. And that is fundamentally what's wrong with the system. And that's fundamentally why Obama failed, because he wasn't willing to say, we're not achieving our goals.
What happened when he pushed back, Bill?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. He didn't push back hard enough. I mean, Obama came into office just as Joe Biden has come into office and populated his national security structure and with a retired general, Jim Jones, who was his national security advisor. He kept on Bob Gates, the Republican Secretary of Defense, to be his Secretary of Defense. And so right away, he was speaking out of one side of his mouth saying, I'm going to end these wars. And on the other hand, he was surrounding himself from people who didn't believe that the wars should end, that we'd achieve our goal. And he never really was able to articulate in a serious way why it was important to end the war, other than it was Bush's war and I want to end Bush's war. Trump did the same thing. I mean, Trump came in also saying the generals are idiots and I want to get out of Afghanistan and Syria. And the system just pummeled him. The system, plus, I might add, the liberal news media.
We'll come to the media and you can give us about Trump, because he sort of was the media is terrified of Trump. And I want to just understand, what did the media get wrong about Trump and the Trump administration's approach to the defense establishment?
Well, look, Donald Trump was an idiot and he had no interest in national security affairs or governing, for that matter. He was a narcissistic buffoon. But his basic intuition, I think, is the basic intuition of most Americans. And that is, why are we fighting over in these places? Are we actually reducing terrorism? Are we actually making the world a better place? And Trump questioned that. And the way he did it, the way he insulted the military, the most respected institution in America, the way he went about seeking a withdrawal of US forces from Syria or from Afghanistan. He, after all, is the one that signed the peace agreement with the Taliban. It just wasn't the way that the national security establishment liked to work. So nobody wanted to see Donald Trump be successful. And his first Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, actually resigned because Trump wanted to accelerate the timeline for the withdrawal of US forces from Syria. And so we're still there. And nobody's even talking about withdrawing from Syria anymore. So I think that Trump had a good intuition, but it's an intuition that in a way had no traction with either the public or with the news media, because who wants to go on the air other than me and say the generals are idiots? Who wants to go on the air and say the military is a fraud? Because every time I have done it, I have been excoriated and I have learned that it's not a good thing to say. But the truth of the matter is, let's just fast forward to the current period. We have Lloyd Austin now as the Secretary of Defense, retired Army general, who was the commander of US forces in Iraq at the time of the withdrawal in 2010. He was a commander of forces in Afghanistan before then. And I would defy anyone to tell me a battle or war that Lloyd Austin has won. And yet
General Larry Ellis says he's a proven leader.
You know, and this is the irony, because he might be a proven leader, but the product that his company is supposed to be creating, they can't create the product. So if we're going to believe the garbage that the Pentagon puts out that says that peace is our profession, then I'd like to see some peace. And so he may be a brilliant man and he may be a fabulous leader, but the end result of our military efforts around the world has to be greater security for the United States. And we have not produced that in 20 years.
Will, as you read his message to the force, we've talked about this in March, are there changes from past policy that you notice? Are there things for the public to be hopeful about? Like, first of all, how would you unpack it? This is where he lays out sort of in broad brushes the strategic mission of the military.
Well, in November 2018, the Pentagon decided under Donald Trump that it was done with the war on terrorism. And it came up with a new defense strategy that was called Great Power Competition. And that basically said that the future of the United States military, which meant money, was in Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, not in continuing to fight terrorism. And there has been a slow shift, really a scramble, if you will, to try to disengage ourselves from these Middle Eastern and African wars and focus more attention on this so-called great power competition. The two interesting innovations that I've so far noticed in the short Biden administration is as follows. One, in that message to the force and in Biden's budget, which just came out this week, there is a subtle shift in how they are dealing with China, in that they call Russia an adversary outright, but they call China the pacing nation. Now, if you don't speak Pentagonese, you probably wouldn't understand what that means, the pacing nation. But the pacing nation means we're going to use China as the exemplar as to how to determine how big the US military needs to be, who is our ultimate competitor that we need to maintain superiority over. Russia's a two-bit country with a GMP that's a third of the size of Western Europe. China is the true competitor. But rather than calling it the adversary, putting it in the same category as Russia, it has made it into this pacing competitor.
So
And
he's
the
opening the
second,
door to
it's very
relations.
much softening it, and it's
Yeah.
very much opening up the possibility of there being meaningful negotiations with China and less of a military confrontation. We'll see whether or not the Pentagon can actually achieve that.
Does
The
China
second,
pose a direct threat to us?
well, I don't think they want to say it.
But what do you think?
You know, if we are talking about national security in its broadest possible manifestations, then obviously China poses the greatest threat to us because economically, socially, demographically, resources, it is the one country that could supplant the United States 10, 20, 30 years in the future. So obviously China is the country that the United States would have to compete with if it were to have to compete with anyone. So if we're going to define national security in this broadest sense, beyond just how many tanks one guy has or how many nukes one guy has, but what the totality of the nation is, there's no question that the United States is on the decline and China is on the increase. Now you have to ask yourself, is it essential that the United States be the strongest military power on the planet? Is it essential that the United States be the top economy? I would say the answer is yes. And I would also say that the answer is we are. I mean, people don't go to China to get medical treatment. People don't go to China for tourism. People aren't trying to clamor to immigrate to China. I mean, the United States is the most powerful and most attractive country on the planet and still is. So I don't necessarily disagree with the assertion that it is our main competitor. I just don't like the fact that the military aggrandizes then the definition of what needs to be done to respond, that everything that needs to be done to respond is military in nature.
Mhm.
And that's what's wrong with our perpetual war system, which is that the military is everything. It's the response to coronavirus. It's the response to terrorism. It's the response to China. And in all three of those cases, one could argue, and I do, that they're not. that when it came to coronavirus, you know, every National Guardsman that was mobilized in order to help with coronavirus was a public health official or a public health officer who wasn't mobilized, because we don't invest in a public health service with the same equality that we do with the military. And in the Middle East, it's the same thing. I think that our fight against terrorism should revert to much more law enforcement and much more border security and non-military means. And the military has a very, very limited role to play, if any role anymore. And we should withdraw most of our forces from the Middle East and stop with this idea that the military is the only institution which is capable of fighting terrorism. And I think, and as I've said with China, I believe the same thing as well. So I'm not optimistic that anything's going to change, because there are strong constituencies, both for fighting in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, in Africa. And those constituencies have now been pumped up over the last decade, and it's going to be hard to unpump them. But I do see some shifts that, at least if we can negotiate with Iran, if we can modulate our relationship with China, and then finally, my biggest conclusion, if the public can be more engaged in national security and foreign policy, then perhaps we will actually see the ability to close the chapter of 9/11 and move on in this country.
So, at the root of the book is this gaping civilian-military divide, and it's a problem that you say has gotten worse over time. Could you first explain that, and how has that continued under Biden? You mentioned Lloyd Austin. Obviously, he was a 4-star general, but to sketch that out. Why is that a problem to have generals as secretaries of defense?
Right. Well, first of all, let me just say that 9/11 was really what started the slippery slide of the public being pushed out of national security. And I'll read a little section from the book. While those engaged in national security go about doing their jobs. No, that's the wrong section. Hold on. Amidst all of the finger pointing on 9/11, a subtle theme emerged that somehow the attacks were the public's fault. The American people had become too soft. They insisted on due process and evidence, emboldening the criminal plotters. They had grown to love liberty too much, placing too many constraints on police power and government spying. They had become too naive about their own safety, imagining that security was cheap and easy. If the intelligence community had failed to penetrate al-Qaeda or provide specific warning of an attack, the reason was that the public insisted on oversight and legality, and the immature public had too much of regard for the constraints on the executive branch that came after Watergate, manacles that neutered law enforcement, tied the hands of the covert operators, and gutted the secret agencies. If the FBI failed, it was because legislators had imposed too many constraints, and civil libertarians who valued their rights over security had prevailed. Those same naive critics stood in the way of effective domestic policing, tending to their privacy and their selfish liberties when no one who is innocent needs to be worried about government spying. If the military had been used ineffectively before 9/11, it was also the American people's fault. They made the armed forces fight according to some version of the Marquis of Queensberry rules, and they lacked the will and the appetite for casualties, even necessary ones. And this public in particular failed to make the sacrifices of their ancestors. To me, that's what started with 9/11. The American public was to blame. That's how the national security establishment in the back of their minds thought it. They thought that if they had had more freedom to operate in the Clinton administration era if they had not focused so much attention on humanitarian intervention and peacekeeping and focused on actual warfare, that they would have prevented 9/11. And so it was the public's fault. And then after 9/11, as the public wanted to see a ferocious campaign against Al-Qaeda, and I thought myself that there would be this blistering, terrible campaign, it turned out that the Pentagon, in fact, didn't want to fight that war. They didn't want to risk having the public come out and be against another Vietnam, another quagmire. So what they did is they started this elongation, which is that we now have been fighting forever. But the end result of it is that the number of people who die has progressively gotten smaller and smaller every year, to where since 2018, and this would probably stun most people, more contractors, civilian contractors, have died in Afghanistan and the Middle East and Africa on the battlefield than soldiers have.
Where can you see their deaths reported, Bill?
Nowhere.
It's
Absolutely nowhere. Bureau of Labor Statistics is the only place that keeps a record of the death of Americans overseas, and then they cluster it by industry, and that's where you see that rather than 7,000 Americans dying since 9/11 in our perpetual wars, actually 11,000 Americans have died since 9/11 in our perpetual wars.
Is it cheaper?
You know, it probably is cheaper in one sense, and that is that you make the public go to sleep. And since we have such a fetish about veterans in our society and such a love of the military, that it really is obscene that 4,000 American citizen contractors can die and not one of their lives is remarked upon in the newspapers, that we don't hold ceremonies for them. We don't bury them in Arlington National Cemetery. We don't provide any financial assistance to their spouses or their survivors. I mean, it's really grotesque. We have created the free market warfare system, but
Okay.
it's not what the American people would want. It's just that it's secret, so people don't know it.
So before we open it up, I just have one question which I wanted to come back to, which is the media's role and journalists' role in this. And you made a very interesting sort of description of the media in which you said the media is part of the national security establishment, which I think most reporters would not consider themselves to be that. But explain that and sort of explain defense reporting in general and how it works and how it sort of helps perpetuate the system.
There was a shift in Washington that happened after the Reagan administration, a really significant social shift. People who used to go home after an administration decided not to go home. They decided to make Washington their homes. And this created the modern lobbying world, the modern establishment of Washington, D.C., where Washington became this cosmopolitan city. And by the way, the richest city in America. 7 of the 15 wealthiest counties in the United States are clustered around Washington, D.C. 7 of the 15 wealthiest. The government is big money. So there has been a change where the establishment has moved into this bubble. And it's not just people who are congressional or our executive branch or our lobbyists. It's also corporations which have moved to Washington, D.C. Big corporations which traditionally were out there in the country. Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, these are all now in Washington, D.C. And so the nature of the place has changed. And then I think the second part of it is that the establishment has become this kind of profit-making zone. So you work in the administration, you have a credential, which then makes you a candidate to be a television commentator. And by virtue of being a commentator and pundit, you increase your economic quotient, which gets you a bigger book contract, which then gets you more attention on TV. And none of it is based upon whether or not any of these people have achieved anything in their actual careers. It's just that they are on this beautiful golden treadmill that we've created in Washington, D.C. And that's the news media as well. I mean, you can't have an MSNBC or a Fox News unless it has its commentators, its paid pundits who are going to be saying exactly what the host wants them to say. So yes, Fox might find more conservative people and MSNBC might find more liberal people, but they don't want anyone who's going to say anything surprising. They want the middle of the road, vanilla liberal and conservative position. And that establishment didn't like Donald Trump for the very reason that he wasn't that vanilla middle of the road. But the truth of the matter is that establishment, which sustains publishing, which sustains newspapers, which sustains every part of the media, is built to be middle of the road and homogenized, because anything that's outside of that is not allowed in.
So where can we as citizens get good information? How can we get educated? What do you suggest? This is the first step. We're all here seeing you today, but
the most important thing I recommend in this book is that we have a renaissance of civic education in America. I lived in the Upper Valley for 20 plus years and knew many kids who went to Hanover High School, reputedly one of the best high schools in America, public high schools. And I was always stunned that they got no civic education. The structure of the government, how the government works, what's the difference between the Army and the National Guard, what is the power of the states versus the federal government. If we don't have that foundation in our school system, then how can we possibly hope to be good citizens? I have literally spent many hours of the last year explaining to people the difference between the National Guard and the Army during coronavirus, when the National Guard was doing one thing and the Army was doing another, because people didn't understand even that fundamental part of the way in which the government and the military is organized. So to me, the long-term solution is all about civic education. It's about introducing a whole system of civic education into our society.
thank you. Should we begin with, do we have some questions?
Sure, we do actually. Not necessarily in any order. This question is about the fact that presidents and defense establishments can't or won't end the wars. Now with the great power competition, do you think that regional and proxy wars will increase or decrease? And basically, how will that affect the dynamic of things?
So if you look at Afghanistan as an example, we're going to withdraw 2,500 of the last US troops in Afghanistan by 9/11, September 11th, 2021. And what will be left on the ground in Afghanistan is about 8,000 or 9,000 US and NATO trainers. Those are still people in uniform. And then about another 8,000 contractors. That's people who do everything from targeting to air conditioning repair. And then another 1,000 or so special operators, either CIA or what are called black special operators of Joint Special Operations Command. So we will have achieved withdrawing the Marine Corps and Army combat units while leaving all of the rest behind. And that model is essentially what is reproduced in Iraq, Syria, in Niger, in Mali, in Somalia, in Uganda, in all of these countries where we are currently bombing and killing. And so that model is essentially a proxy model because the US soldiers are no longer the predominant people on the ground. And that's the structure of perpetual war, but it is also very much the way in which the Pentagon is slowly withdrawing from these Middle East conflicts while at the same time continuing to fight them.
That actually leads into the next question. And will that model maintain stability and security in Afghanistan and prevent it from becoming a terrorist base again?
Well, I'll pick at the question. It will not create stability, but asking whether or not it will allow Afghanistan to become a terrorist base again, meaning an Al-Qaeda-like organization emerging that has the capacity to plan a multi-year, gigantic, diabolical event, is the wrong way of looking at it. So I don't think we're going to see the reemergence of an Al-Qaeda anytime in the future, not an Al-Qaeda with that kind of global capacity and to undertake a catastrophic attack. Those days are gone. It's like thinking about like hijacking airplanes, right? The last hijacked airplanes, of an epidemic occurred in the 1970s. And the only way in which the hijackers were successful on 9/11 was that they killed people aboard and took control of the planes themselves. But hijacking used to be the biggest terrorist problem. And then it was 9/11 and the spectacular attacks that preceded it in the African embassies in 1998, et cetera. And I would say that as I look to the future, that a huge part of what we're going to see is this shift that we're just going to ignore that Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or ISIS exist as large entities, and we're going to focus more and more attention on the question of stability as defined by the United States. And that's a different kind of a stability. So no, it's not going to get rid of the Taliban. It's not going to get rid of even the remnants of Al-Qaeda, but I don't even think that that's what they necessarily believe anymore. They believe now, well, we're not going to have another 9/11, so we've achieved that goal. And they believe as well that because 9/11 has now come and gone in 20 years, that they're going to get away with withdrawing from Afghanistan, watch it revert to the Taliban, hope that they can put pressure on the Afghans to ensure that the Taliban doesn't support an Al-Qaeda-like organization in the future. But if that's what you want to think is a stable country or a secure country, well, I mean, then you agree with the government, because they're going to put all sorts of veils in front of the definition of stability and security in order to claim that they have ended the war.
So on a related but different topic, this question is very straightforward. Can we reduce the military budget? Could we even reduce it by half?
Well, I mean, the size of the military budget increased over all of the years of the Obama administration, and it is now increased again under Biden. So I don't know what people mean anymore when they say reduce the military, because you have a Democratic and a Republican system that essentially supports high defense spending. That's going to continue forever.
So how do we turn that around?
Well, I think, again, the answer of how to turn it around really is about, it's about taking control of the national security establishment and reorienting the focus of the national security establishment away from the military. It's not going to be achieved by canceling the F-35 or by eliminating this or that organization. It's going to be achieved by by making the non-military institutions of our society and of our foreign policy establishment more important, by giving more money to the State Department and less money to the military, by making stronger institutions which have the power to be able to be stronger brokers against the Pentagon. And that's going to take place over a long period of time. I don't see any weapon system that's currently on the blueprints being canceled by the Biden administration. I don't see any major innovation that's currently taking place within the military, the creation of the Space Force, the creation of Cyber Command and cyber capabilities being eliminated by the Biden administration. The only thing that's going to make a difference is if we build up civilian institutions which are going to have equal power and capability to the Pentagon. That's what we need to focus our attention on. Canceling this or that weapon system is a fool's errand.
So it goes back to the checks and balances that we're supposed to be operating under.
Yeah, and I mean, as long as Congress is focused on, Congress and not on the government and not on governing the country and not on being the oversight and the check, then it seems to me we're not going to have any of that happen.
So somebody asked you, in a perfect world, how would you define or measure security?
Well, in a perfect world, I would say, are we stronger and safer today than we were a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And the answer, as I say in this book, is intrinsically no. There's not a country in the Middle East that's safer today than it was in 2001. There's not a country in Africa that's safer today than it was in 2001. We have not achieved that fundamental goal. And though we say we have killed 40,000, 50,000 terrorists, there are still 200,000 terrorists around the world. So the truth of the matter is that we have not even reduced the cadre of people who are seeking terrorism or those who are attracted to terrorism as a way of doing harm to the United States. So first, I think, as I've said, and I'll say it again, we need more civilian involvement in matters of national security. And second, I suggest what I call the Global Security Index, a kind of Dow Jones Industrial Average of trying to put some facts behind security and safety. In other words, taking events that occur in a day-to-day and measuring them against, do those events create greater or lesser security? And if we had such an index, my conviction is that people would begin to see, wait a minute, the numbers are constantly going down. Why aren't we doing things to make the numbers go up? Why aren't we doing things to increase our level of security? But we have no objective measure today of how to do it. And I think with big data, and I think with the news, and I think with the ability of software today, there would be a possibility of creating some kind of a security index like this that would be real time, that would be like as ubiquitous as the Dow Jones in terms of like being reported on the news that the global security index went up 0.3 points today or went down today, that this would make a real difference in the way people would be able to understand something which I think even many in government can't understand, which is the totality of the picture. They're so engaged in the day-to-day that they can't take a step back and answer the question of, are we making ourselves safer?
Interesting. So the next question, actually a couple of them I'm going to mush together, it has to do with the Pentagon selling fear. If the Pentagon is selling fear of terrorism, fear of Russia and China, what should these civilian institutions you're seeking to counterbalance the Pentagon be selling instead? And are there proactive steps that the U.S. Should take to push in that direction?
Well, the Pentagon actually has become a terribly politically correct organization, and I don't think it's selling anything other than the Pentagon right now. It's selling that the military is good, that the military is doing all the right things, that the military is fighting extremism, that the military is welcoming transgendered individuals into the ranks, that the military is solving the question of sexual assault. I mean, that's what the Pentagon is today. They're not the ones who are screaming about the Russians or about the Chinese or Iranians or the North Koreans. If anything, they're the ones that say, oh, hold on, let's look at this in a careful way. So we're really talking about the news media is responsible for making the world seem as if it's a disaster that's always right around the corner. And of course, the Pentagon is the beneficiary of that, because if you think that Iran is a big threat, or North Korea or Russia or China, then you're going to basically agree to increases in defense spending, or you're going to at least agree to the $1 trillion that we currently spend on national security. So the answer, I think, is in both understanding better the dynamics of the relationship between the news media and news media reporting and the national security issue. But I think the second answer is really that we have to change the way we see national security to hold those who are the guardians of national security more accountable for actual security, so that the end result is that we don't just give them more money to continue their game, that we actually ask them to show some results in the process of doing so. If we could do that, then I imagine we would begin to see some reduction. But reduction, it's tricky. It's tricky because we've created this magnificent military machine, second to none, global in nature, that outstrips anything else on the planet, that every other country in our orbit, which means 3/4 of the countries of the world, are completely dependent upon. The Europeans can't fly an airplane in the Middle East without American aerial refueling. The Dutch, the Germans, the British can't drop a bomb without the United States targeting or doing the intelligence work. Nobody in Africa or in the Middle East can operate any of their equipment without Americans doing the maintenance and doing the logistics. So the truth of the matter is that we've created this system which everyone is dependent upon, and it's going to be really hard to unravel it. What we don't have are priorities.
Bill, when you wrote, I wondered if I could just read a paragraph from your resignation letter, which I think sort of captures a lot of sort of the way this institution is covered. You wrote, in our day-to-day whirlwind and hostage status as prisoners of Donald Trump, I think, like everyone else does, that we miss so much. People who don't understand the medium or the pressures loudly opine that it's corporate control, or worse, that it's partisan. Sometimes I quip in response to friends on the outside and to government sources that if they mean by the word partisan that it is New Yorkers and Washingtonians against the rest of the country, they are right. For me, I realized how out of step I was when I looked at Trump's various bumbling intuitions, his desire to improve relations with Russia, to denuclearize North Korea, to get out of the Middle East, to question why we're fighting in Africa, even in his attacks on the intelligence community and the FBI. Of course, he's an ignorant and incompetent imposter, and yet I'm alarmed at how quick NBC is to mechanically argue the contrary, be in favor of policies that spell more conflict and more war. That really
I mean, look, the entire establishment came out and said Donald Trump was an idiot for seeking denuclearization of North Korea, seeking it. Whether he was going to be successful or not, that's another question. But they said he was a buffoon for trying. And so what do we have now? We have the Biden administration basically going back to now defining North Korea as the potential enemy of the future. And we're going to be going nowhere, as we have been for the last 30 years, as we've watched North Korea develop its nuclear weapons and now its nuclear missiles. And I don't see any solution. And so we're building either the incentive for conflict between the United States and North Korea. We're building the incentive for conflict between the United States and Israel. I mean, take the cyber attack in Israel this week. There was a cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear facility that makes uranium. The centrifuges then therefore stopped operating. That means they have to regen the whole system up. It was obviously a cyber attack by the Israelis. The United States is saying we didn't have anything to do with it. But the truth of the matter is that what it really does is it creates a system by which the Iranians become more secretive. They become more justified in their own minds in seeing themselves as the aggressive opponents and competitors with the rest of the Middle East. And so it's not a process by which you're building the capacity for there to be the restoration of peaceful relations. That is, by the way, the very definition of just warfare. That you fight war and you pursue war in a way that makes it possible for there to be peace when it's over. And we do not have a strategy vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis North Korea or Iran, not in Afghanistan, Iraq, or against ISIS, in which we can achieve the goal that has been there since St. Thomas Aquinas, that says you fight in order to restore peaceful relations. And if we're not doing that, then we are not doing the right thing.
Wow.
Now you don't have to buy the book.
Oh, but
I hope you do.
You do have steps and ideas and what's the word I'm looking for? To move ahead, to not just be stuck in this place.
I
And
say that the
think
most
that's
important one, Liza, is that we need a psychological shift. And the psychological shift is we need to question our reverence of the military. We need to take the national security establishment apart and stop seeing all these guys who were the failures of and the creators of 9/11, the failures of the last 2 decades that we're now watching on TV, and we're taking their advice. It would be like having, a whole cadre of doctors who have been sued for malpractice being the commentators on television. And we don't hold these guys accountable in any way. So I say that the answer has to be that we start to hold people accountable for the results that they have created. And that means no more Lloyd Austins as Secretary of Defense. We need real civilians who have real historical knowledge and background and civilian aesthetics. No more national security establishment being rewarded for its failures, and no more fighting when you cannot say in that fighting that it is actually improving the security of the United States or creating greater stability. It's a psychological shift more than anything else. We have to take back the streets.
Well, hopefully when you're here for your next book, we can talk about the wonderful index on security and human rights and happiness, and they're all going in the right direction.
Well, okay, I'll be back in 2035. Thank you so much for having me here, Liza.
Well, thank you for
really
coming.
Appreciate it.
James, do you have any last comments for us?
I just bring the guidance system back. I want to see it again.
Okay, well, thank you both so much, and thank you everybody for joining us. As I said, the audio, the video of this will be up on our website in a bit. Usually takes a couple of days to a week, and hope you'll join us for another event. We have a real mix of different kinds of authors coming, and you can find a link to the book on the side, the chat bar, or just call the store and pre-order Bill's other books, and come visit us after the 24th. We're so excited to have you back in the store. So without further ado, good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Liza, for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.